In just 6 minutes, let's explore and understand the new Particle Auth Core Web SDK. So just last week, we released a major update to the mechanism that facilitates social logins within our tech stack. This is Particle Auth. Specifically, we introduced a new SDK, the Particle Auth Core SDK. This acts as an alternative to the typical Particle Auth SDK that you might already be familiar with if you've watched any of these videos before or read through our documentation, as the Particle Auth Core SDK provides developers building web applications with a more streamlined and customizable means of integrating Particle Auth. So basically this means that you can customize a UI and UX down to being extremely specific to your given application. So basically added customization control over the authentication and utilization modal of Particle's wallet as a service. Another big change present within the Auth Core SDK is actually the migration from a pop-up and redirect based login and approval system, meaning that typically with the traditional Particle Auth SDK, whenever you log in or confirm a transaction, this opens up a new window, a redirect, that prompts the user for confirmation. Instead, with the Auth Core SDK, we're actually embedding these pop-ups and the login process directly within the application, removing the need for window pop-ups between implementation of the Auth Core SDK and the typical Auth SDK. I'll also run through a quick demo showcasing what using the Auth Core SDK actually looks like for an end user. So let's jump right into it. To start, I'd like to add some quick context. Essentially, in today's video, we're not going to be creating an application step by step, but instead comparing a standard application structure that you may be familiar with between both SDKs. Specifically, if you've used Particle before, and if you've seen our content, then this structure might look familiar to you. This is a demo application, in this case built on Phantom, that facilitates authentication with the Particle Auth SDK and sends a sample user operation. As you can see, this application is quite simple. We're configuring both Particle Network, which is of course imported from the traditional Particle Auth SDK. We're also configuring our account abstraction SDK with Smart Account. We're setting a custom provider to use Ethers, setting the UI to use ERC457, and then building a simple application that continually fetches the balance of the signed in user, handles social login that basically just checks the state of a user session and then either logs them in, or if they're already logged in, returns their user information, and of course the user operation itself, which is just simply a standard Ethers transaction. This is a very simple example of using Particle Auth within a practical application. So how does this flow differ when using the Particle Auth Core SDK? We can achieve the same level of functionality, but with a slightly different implementation. So here's an example using the Auth Core SDK. This is the same application, although in this case using Ethereum Go Early, where a user signs in, we handle all of the login, the balance fetching, and then we send a sample user operation through the same mechanism, in this case Ethers, as we did within the previous demo. As you may have noticed, there's a few key differences. First of all, there's no particle network. This typically is the master configuration object, although in this case, as you'll see in a moment, we actually configure Particle in a separate file. The lack of a central particle network object means that we also use React hooks for most of our interaction. So we have provider, which is our custom Particle 1193 provider object. We have connect and disconnect, which is basically log in and log out. And we have user info, which is a JSON object representing information about the currently logged in user. We're still configuring Smart Account the same way, as we're still using the Particle Account Abstraction SDK. We're also still setting a custom provider. And as you can see, the actual application structure looks almost identical. Although of course we're using connect as our method of facilitating the initial social login pop-up. We're using disconnect to handle logout. And rather than manually assigning user info, we're just depending on the hook to continually stay updated and drive the application. Okay, but how do we actually configure Particle Auth? Where's the configuration here? Well, instead of having this contained within the typical app component, instead what we can do is throw this into index.tsx. As you can see here, we're basically wrapping our app component in Auth Core Context Provider, which presents a very similar structure to what you may be familiar with within the Particle Network configuration. But in this case, we're throwing all of the options out here within the central location. So of course, configuring the project ID, client key, and app ID, setting the different authentication types supported, the theme type, fiat coin, language. These configurations extend far beyond just what I'm showcasing right here. But the important thing to note is that instead of having all of this within a single declaration of a Particle Network object, we're including that in Auth Core Context Provider right here. So let's compare the difference in user experience between the two implementations. We can start with the Phantom demo. Again, this uses the typical Particle Auth SDK. Essentially, you click on sign in with Google or sign in with Twitter. And the big thing here is, as you can see, this actually opens up a new window, a pop-up that redirects me to, in this case, a collection of my Google accounts. So I click on this account here, and now I'm logged in. So let's see what executing user operation looks like and draw some parallels between that and what we just saw within the pop-up login process. As you can see, we have another pop-up, a new window was opened, and we can confirm this user operation right here. Okay, so with that established, let's move on to the Auth Core demo and show you some of the differences there. Okay, so here we are on my deployment of the Auth Core demo. As you can see, it's quite simple. It looks very similar to the previous demo, but in this case, we're using the Auth Core SDK. So let's start by signing in with Google. And as you can see, instead of a pop-up, we're handling this directly within the same window instance. So now that I'm logged in, Let's try the execute user operation button. And as you can see, we actually have no pop-up here. This is all native within this application. This is a direct UI element, sort of like how the wallet modal is, but instead we're doing the confirmation natively within the UI here. And of course, this entire flow and look is totally customizable, so you can really hone this in to be a very seamless and natural experience for your end users. The possibilities within the Particle Auth Core SDK run deep. If you'd like to learn more about using the Auth Core SDK, I'll have our documentation for it linked below. Additionally, we have a version of the Particle Web demo deployed specifically for the Auth Core SDK, which you can also find linked below.